Hello there, my name is Chris Cooke and I am the founder and managing director of CMU. We're a London-based company that help people to navigate and understand the music business, and today I'm here to deliver a speed briefing all about the digital music market. In this session, I'm going to talk through the key digital and streaming services you need to be aware of today. We're going to look at the deals that have been done between the music industry and those streaming services, and most importantly of all, we're going to talk about how artists and songwriters get paid when their music is streamed. So that's what we've got to cover. Let's get going with this speed briefing. Let's begin by taking a look at the digital music market today. And first, where does digital, and specifically streaming, fit into the wider recorded music business? Which is to say, that side of the music industry that generates income for artists and their business partners through the exploitation, the licensing, the distribution, the sales and the streaming of recorded music. If we look at all of the money that the global record industry, all the record companies, all the music distributors, and all the record industry collecting societies made in 2020, we can break it down like this. You will immediately see that digital is by far the biggest revenue generator for the record industry today. Although, on the left-hand side of this slide, you will also see that physical, the sale of CDs and vinyl, is still generating money for the record industry. Let's dig a little bit deeper on this. In 2020, the global record industry made 19.5% of its revenues through the sale of CD and vinyl. Now, it is true that physical is much more important in some markets than others. Japan, second biggest recorded music market in the world, famously is still a CD market. The Japanese record industry still makes most of its money by selling CDs. But Japan is a bit unusual in that domain. There are other countries where physical product sales, CD and vinyl, bring in hardly anything for the record industry. And then some of the big European markets are still bringing in some physical income, even though it is a minority revenue stream. But on a global basis, nearly a fifth of recorded music revenues are still coming from the sale of physical discs. But we're interested today in digital, which you will see is the biggest revenue stream for the record industry. It's also the fastest growing revenue stream for the record industry. And today, when we talk about digital, we're really talking about streaming services. There are still some download stores, and 5.8% of record industry revenues in 2020 did come from the sale of downloads, but most of that money is coming from streaming services, albeit a number of different kinds of streaming service. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But quickly, what are these other revenue streams that have these boxes on the right-hand side? Well, if we take the bigger of the smaller boxes on the right-hand side of the slide, that's broadcast and public performance. That's the money that comes into the record industry from radio, and it would also include TV in many countries, and when music, recorded music, is played in pubs, clubs, bars, and cafes. This is the money that comes into the record industry through the collective licensing system. And then finally, on the far right-hand side, we have sync, when recorded music is synchronized into movies and games and adverts and corporate videos. A relatively small revenue stream, but nevertheless an important revenue stream for the record industry. But crucially, digital and specifically streaming is the biggest revenue generator for the global record industry. And as I say, just as importantly, it continues to be the fastest growing revenue stream as well. Okay, let's now think about the different kinds of digital services that are bringing in all of that money. As I say, we do still have some download stores that are bringing in a little bit of money, but downloads have been in decline for 7 or 8 years now. Really, the iTunes store, which was always by far the biggest download store, peaked around about 2013. And since about 2015, it's been all about streaming when it comes to growth in the record industry, and steep growth at that. So we're more interested in the streaming services. But we can also break down the streaming services. One big distinction is between the paid-for services and the free streaming services. Now, most of the free streaming services are actually the free tiers of platforms that also have paid-for services. So the Spotify free tier, for example. But free streaming is a really big deal in terms of users. The free services have significant user bases. Spotify has more free users than paying users. And in some countries, the majority of people streaming are streaming through free services rather than paid for services. So in terms of users, free streaming services are really important. Although it's important to stress that when it comes to revenue, the free services generate a lot less revenue than the premium services. The premium services are where the majority of streaming money is made, and therefore, today, where the majority of the record industry's money is made. Premium streaming is the most important revenue stream. As we have done here, we can split the streaming services into the big guys and the little guys. Which is to say, there are a number of premium streaming services which operate on an almost global basis. Their services are available in many different countries, and in some cases, nearly all countries now. However, some of those streaming services, premium streaming services, have lots more users than others. So, with the global services, we can split them into those that have tens of millions of subscribers versus those that probably have a few million premium subscribers and possibly less. We can also make a distinction between the global platforms, like the ones I've been referring to so far, and the regional platforms. In some countries, particularly certain emerging markets, and certainly some emerging markets in Asia, in addition to the global platforms, and sometimes instead of the global platforms, we have regional services, significant streaming services that only operate in one or a small number of markets, but in those markets, those services are as big or bigger than the global services. So let's now put some brand names to these different kinds of digital services. Download stores, iTunes is still the biggest, even though iTunes peaked long ago. And of course, in dance music, Beatport is still an important player. Amazon, in the markets where it operates, still sells some downloads. And I suppose we could also put some of the direct-to-fan platforms here as well, the most obvious being Bandcamp. When it comes to free streaming on a global basis, a number of services that operate globally have free tiers, but probably the most important is Spotify and SoundCloud. Then, of course, you have YouTube. Now, YouTube is an interesting platform when we're trying to classify the different sorts of services, because YouTube is many things. But if we think about the main YouTube platform, not the specific YouTube music service, but the main YouTube platform, there's an awful lot of music, both video and audio, on that platform, and plenty of people go to the main YouTube platform to access that music for free. When it comes to the premium services, the big guys will be led by Spotify, by far the biggest premium streaming service in the world in terms of users and therefore revenue. But we would also include Apple Music in there. The Amazon paid-for music service. Amazon's service is not available in quite as many countries as Spotify and Apple. It's some way behind in terms of global expansion. But in the countries where it is operating, it has started to see decent traction, and particularly in countries like the US and the UK, the Amazon paid-for streaming services have become quite significant. And then we have YouTube again, but now we're talking about YouTube Music. YouTube's specific music service, its paid-for music service, that in recent years has also had some decent growth as well. Then you have services like Deezer and Tidal and Napster and SoundCloud's paid-for offer. These are much smaller in terms of total number of users. A service like Deezer is significant in a couple of markets, particularly France, its home market. Deezer is also more significant in a market like Brazil. But compared to Spotify, Apple, and even Amazon and YouTube, they are relatively small in terms of users. And then we have the regional services. Services which operate in a small number of markets, but which may be significant in those markets. Let's begin with Pandora and iHeart. Most of these regional services are in emerging markets, but Pandora and iHeart are in the opposite than that. The US, the biggest recorded music market in the world. Pandora and iHeart are actually personalized radio services rather than fully on-demand streaming, and they are significant players within the US. Not as significant as they once were, but nevertheless, they're important. Then we have services like the Tencent services and the NetEase cloud music service in China. Apple is available in the Chinese market, but Spotify is not. And really, when it comes to streaming in China, we're talking about the services run by Tencent. Tencent actually run a number of different services in China, things like QQ Music. They also have a karaoke service called WeSing, and their main competitor in China is NetEase Cloud Music. In Russia, Spotify and Apple are available, but there are also significant music services run by Russian web companies, internet companies. Yandex, a big search engine in Russia, has a music service, and VK, a big social network in Russia, has a music service. In India, again, Spotify and Apple are both present, but the significant local players are JioSaavn and Gaana. Then we have some services that are operating in a handful of other Asian markets, Melon, particularly important in South Korea, and then services like KKBox and Rezo and Jukes. And finally, if we look at Africa and the Middle East, those are markets which are really still to play for. Spotify and Apple are trying to grab market share in many African and Middle Eastern markets, but we also have Angami, which is a decent player within the Middle East and North Africa, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, what Boomplay are up to is very interesting. So there you go. We can break down the streaming services and the wider digital services into a number of categories. The download stores, the free global streaming services, the paid-for global streaming services, and maybe we split them up into the big guys and the little guys, and then the regional services as well. Although there's one other category of services that it's important to mention under the streaming banner that we've not yet covered. And those are the user-generated content and video sharing platforms. So the main part of YouTube, the main YouTube platform, and we would now include things like YouTube Shorts as part of that. Then you've got Facebook and Instagram, you've got TikTok, and you've got Triller. These are not music services in the way that Spotify and Apple Music are music services. They are content services, they are video sharing services. But music appears in a lot of the video content that is uploaded. And you could argue, particularly with a service like TikTok, the music is often a key part of the video that is uploaded by the user, the creator, the influencer. The music is not just in the background. The music plays a key role in the video experience that is being shared. All of these platforms now have licensing deals with the music industry, and it used to be that users would manually add music to videos on their devices, put the video into the app, and then upload it. Okay? But recorded music was being used, songs were being used, and those needed to be licensed. Of course, increasingly creators using these technologies are actually pulling music from within the app, from the Instagram music library, the TikTok music library. So today, labels are actually putting their recordings, or at least snippets of their recordings, into the music libraries on these apps, and that is how the music is being used, and that music is licensed by the music industry. So these services, although often talked about as important marketing channels in the music industry, and they're very important marketing channels in the music industry, they are also becoming important revenue generators as well. So, in addition to the download stores, the free streaming services, the global streaming services, the regional streaming services, the big guys, the little guys, we should always remember the user-generated content and video sharing platforms as well. Okay, let's now talk about the relationship between the music industry and the digital platforms. The deals that are done, the licensing deals that are done between the music industry and all of the different digital and streaming platforms we've talked about here today. Before we get into this, it's important to remind ourselves that when we talk about music rights, which are the rights that are being exploited by these digital and streaming services, we must always remember that there are actually two distinct sets of music copyright. Because copyright law treats songs and recordings separately. So when you write a song, you create a copyright. When you record a track, you create a copyright. We have the song rights and the recording rights. Sometimes we call song rights publishing rights or author rights. Sometimes we call recording rights master rights or phonographic rights. But they are two distinct sets of copyright. And because copyright law treats songs and recordings separately, so does the music industry. So we have two distinct strands of the music industry, both dealing in copyright. We have the music publishing sector focused on the song rights, and the record industry focused on the recording rights. This is important because when digital services and streaming services come along and seek to access music, they usually have to license these two sets of rights separately. So we need to do one set of deals with the music publishing sector to get permission to stream songs, and another set of deals with the record industry to get permission to stream recordings. Because the music industry is licensing the two sets of music rights to digital services separately. In terms of who is actually negotiating these licensing deals, issuing these licenses, who is it that has the actual day-to-day relationships with services like Spotify and Apple Music and YouTube and TikTok and so on? Well, when it comes to managing the relationships and issuing the licenses in recordings and songs to all the streaming services we've spoken about here today, on the recording side, it is record labels and music distributors who negotiate the deal and issue the license. So as an artist, you either need to be dealing with a record label, or you can set up your own label, in essence, and work with a music distributor. And those labels and distributors are then going to negotiate deals with the streaming services. Some labels negotiate deals directly, particularly the majors, Sony, Universal, and Warner. There's also an organization called Merlin, which negotiates template deals on behalf of a big chunk of the independent sector. So as a label, you could opt into a Merlin deal. Some labels also work with distributors, and some distributors utilize Merlin deals. And then you have the artists who are self-releasing through their own labels, and they will need to find a distributor. But that is just the recordings. When labels and distributors and Merlin are negotiating deals and issuing licenses to streaming services, they are only negotiating a deal covering the recording rights. And of course, once the deal is done, those labels and distributors then actually deliver the recordings to the digital platform. But what about the songs that are contained in those recordings? Well, they are licensed separately. Sometimes the songs are licensed by music publishers. That would include Sony Music Publishing, Universal's publishing division, Warner Chappell, which is the publishing company of Warner Music, and companies like Cobalt and BMG. Some publishers work with an organization called Impel, which is a bit like the Merlin of song rights. And Impel will negotiate template deals with the services on behalf of the publishers they are working with. Although we should stress that in a lot of countries around the world, actually, it's not the music publishers who are issuing the licenses. It's the collecting societies, the collective management organizations, the entities that also license when songs are performed live or played on the radio or they go out on TV. Those collecting societies in many countries are also leading when it comes to digital licensing and the deals with the streaming services. And some of those collecting societies negotiate deals directly with the platforms. Others come together and form what we might call copyright hubs, organizations like Polaris and Eyeife, who then negotiate deals on behalf of a number of different collecting societies. So, when it comes to the deal making in streaming, on the recording side, it's labels and distributors and Merlin who are negotiating the deals. On the song side, it's publishers, it's organizations like Impel, and in many cases, it's collecting societies and copyright hubs. So those are the entities that are doing the deals. So as I say, as an artist, you need either a label or a distributor to get your music into the system and licensed. But on the song side, you're going to need either a publisher or maybe your collecting society will do the deal for you and collect your money. Okay, so we know who's doing the deal, but what does the deal look like? The deals that are done between the music industry and the streaming services are complicated. What I'm going to do today is describe to you how the deals that have been negotiated with services like Spotify and Apple Music, what those deals look like. And the first thing to say is that with streaming, there are no per play rates. Several times a year, a little chart does the rounds on social media that tells you that every time your track is streamed on Apple and Spotify and YouTube, etc., this is how much you earn. This is the sum of money, it's usually a fraction of a penny or a cent, that you're going to earn every time your track is streamed. And the chart will always tell you that Apple pays the most, Spotify pays less, and YouTube pays even less. But the key thing to know is there are no per play rates. That's not how streaming works. It is true that every month we can average how much money we receive from a streaming service and how many times our tracks were played in that month, and we can get an average per stream or per play payout. But it's not that the streaming service starts with a rate card, a per play rate card, sees how many streams you've got and multiplies one by the other. That's not how streaming works. Because streaming is a revenue share based on consumption share business. And the streaming services are dividing up the money and sharing it out with labels and publishers and distributors and societies and artists and songwriters on a country-by-country basis and for each of the different subscription types. So with Spotify, that would mean that the payments for the premium service will be calculated separately from the payments for the free service. What does this mean? Revenue share based on consumption share. Well, if we look at this from an artist perspective, basically the way streaming monies are shared out each month, it's a three-stage process. Step 1, track allocation. Step 2, revenue share. Step 3, artist royalty. So let's talk through each of those in turn. First of all, track allocation. A service like Spotify has 70 to 80 million tracks on the system. It then sells subscriptions, and on the free service, it sells advertising. It also monitors every track that is being streamed, and at the end of the month, it has for each country and each subscription type a chunk of money and a chunk of data. And the first thing it needs to do is it needs to allocate the money to all of the tracks in the system. And it does that based on total consumption share within any one subscription type within any one market. Okay, what the hell does that mean? Well, let me explain. So let's say you are a subscriber of a service like Spotify, and every month you are putting in some money. So if you are subscribing in the US, you will be putting in $10 every month. Once you've paid your money, you then listen to a load of music. So at the end of the month, Spotify has a record of all the tracks that you listen to and how many times you listen to. So basically it's a spreadsheet with a line for every single play, and the line will tell us which recording that play was of. So for you as a subscriber, Spotify has some money and some data. What Spotify then does at the end of the month is it takes the money that you've put in and it takes your data and it pools it. So it pools your money with everybody else's money, all of the other money that came in, and it puts your data with everybody else's data. So then what Spotify has is a load of money and a big spreadsheet with a line for every single play, identifying which track, which recording was streamed. Then we get into the consumption share part of this process. What Spotify says is, okay, for any one track, what percentage of total consumption did that track account for? And whatever percentage of consumption the track accounted for, the track is allocated that percentage of the money. So if you account for 0.1% of consumption, you're going to get 0.1% of the money. And then, step 1, track allocation is complete. Every track in the system has been allocated a sum of money based on the percentage of consumption it accounted for. Then we can get to step 2, revenue share. Those licensing deals that have been negotiated by labels and distributors and Merlin on the recording side, and by publishers and Impel and collecting societies and copyright hubs on the song side, the key element of those deals is a revenue share agreement. And basically, what the label distributor Merlin is saying, what the publisher Impel Society Hub is saying is, any money that is allocated to a track that contains a recording that we control or a song that we control, you're going to give us a share of that allocation. So what is that share? Well, every deal is different. However, as a general rule, the owner or the entity that controls a sound recording, copyright, is probably going to get somewhere between 50 to 55% of any money allocated to a track that they control. Meanwhile, on the song side, the publisher the songwriter, the society, etc., is probably going to get between 10 to 15% of any money allocated to a track that contains their song. Which means, of course, that the streaming service gets to keep 30 to 35% of the money, and that's where the streaming service pays for all of its costs and makes a profit margin. So, money is being allocated to each track based on consumption share, and then the allocation that goes to each track is shared out with the music industry, with 50 to 55% of that allocation going to the recording rights, 10 to 15% to the song rights, and the service keeping 30 to 35%. Which then brings us to step 3, artist royalty. At this point, Spotify has done everything that it needs to do, because Spotify's deals are with labels and distributors and Merlin, and with publishers and societies and hubs, etc. And providing Spotify, or whichever streaming service it is, has reported to its recording licensing partners and paid them their money, and it's reported to its song licensing partners and paid them their money, the streaming service has now completed its task. It has paid for the music that it has utilized. It is then for the labels and distributors on the recording side and the publishers and societies on the song side to share that money with artists and songwriters. And how that money is shared is totally dependent on the deal that has been done between the artist and the label or distributor they're working with. And on the song side, if it's coming through a publisher, it will depend on the publishing deal. If it's coming through a society, it will depend on the collecting society's distribution rules. But all of that is dependent on the deals or the society rules that are relevant to any one artist or songwriter. Let's look at this from an artist perspective. Let's hone in on the recording side. So, artists often work with labels. And when they sign to a label, the label will then control and possibly own the copyright in the sound recordings that are made. It will monetize those recordings, and it will share any subsequent money with the artist. Now, what share of the revenue, or royalty as we would usually say, is paid to the artist depends entirely on the record deal agreed with the label. And it could be anywhere from a few percent up to 50%. It could indeed go higher. But generally speaking, with label royalties, today, the deal is likely to pay the artist something like a 20 to 25% royalty, although some indie labels, which are probably putting in less money up front, might do a 50-50 profit share split. However, if you signed your deal with a label in the pre-digital age, and it was a conventional record deal rather than a 50-50 profit share split, the chances are you're on a lower royalty. Because pre-2000, generally speaking, labels which were paying a royalty rather than a 50-50 profit share split were probably paying something like a 15% royalty, and in the 80s, 12%, and in the 70s, 9%, and so on and so forth. Now, some labels, even when they did deals 30, 40 years ago, and even when those deals were paying the artist a lower royalty, will still pay a higher royalty on streaming income, even though technically they don't have to. So there are labels who are paying 20 to 25% of money over to artists on all deals, oblivious of what the deal actually says. But there are other labels who are still paying those lower royalty rates that were set out in pre-digital contracts, even on streaming income. So where an artist is signed to the label, they could be getting a few percent if it was a really old deal. They're probably getting something more like 20 to 25%, particularly if it's a newer deal. Or maybe they've done a 50-50 profit share deal with their label and they're getting 50% of the money. Of course, these days, plenty of artists basically set up their own labels and release the music themselves. And instead of working with a label, they work with a distributor. For artists at the start of their career, this is often the only way to get music to market. But there are more established artists who also go this route because they are entrepreneurial and they want to run their own label. Maybe they get a little bit more control by releasing music through their own label. They almost certainly get to keep more of the money. And so where an artist has set up their own label and they're working with a distributor, they could be getting 100% of the money. Some distributors charge upfront fees that the artist pays, and then the artist gets all the money that comes in. If they're working with a distributor on a commission basis, they may be getting 80, 90% of the money. If the distributor is providing a whole load of extra services to the artist beyond distribution, like marketing and content creation, then the distributor is going to want more money. And if a distributor is throwing every service possible at you, then they could well be taking 50% of the money. But the key point here is The streaming service pays the label or distributor it has to deal with 50 to 55% of any money that is allocated to the tracks they control. But what percentage of that is then paid to the artist is entirely dependent on the artist's record deal, or if they're releasing music for their own label, on the distribution deal they have done. So that is the digital music market today, and a very speedy beginner's guide to digital licensing. In terms of practical tips for those of you who are self-releasing artists or small independent labels, obviously to get your music streaming and to be part of all of this, you need business partners. You need a label or maybe initially a distributor to get your music into the services, to basically license your recordings. But remember, distributors and labels are only ever licensing recording rights, so you also need to make sure you're getting your song royalties. And most artists who write their own songs will begin by allowing their collecting society to do that, and then maybe down the line they start working with a publisher who gets involved in that licensing. Beyond being part of a license for recordings and songs, obviously you need to actually deliver your music to the platforms, your recordings, and that's where a distributor will help. And once you've done all of that, you're in the system. Your music is available, and when your music is streamed, you're going to earn money. And then begins the really tricky bit. Actually, it's relatively easy to get your music into the streaming services today. The challenge is getting people to listen, and not just to listen when the music is new, but to listen again and again and again. Because if we think about it, streaming is a fundamentally different way of doing business than selling discs and downloads. And this is something the entire music industry has been learning about over the last 5, maybe 10 years. Because, let's think about it. When you sell a disc or a download, all of your marketing activity is focused on building hype around release. Because if we're being honest, when we used to put out music as discs and downloads, if people were going to buy the music, there's a very high chance they were going to buy it within a few weeks or maybe a few months of release. Okay, you might sell some extra copies down the line, but the majority of sales are probably going to happen around release. So, you put out a record, you do a load of marketing, you build a load of hype, people buy it, they download it, the money comes in, and then the money will take a few months to work its way through the system, and it ends up in the label's bank account, and then the artist gets their share. So, it's all relatively self-contained in a relatively small period of time. And either you have a successful launch and you sell a lot of records, or you don't. But in the streaming age, you're not getting an upfront chunk of money when the music is sold or downloaded. Instead, you're getting a small micropayment, fractions of a penny or a cent, every single time the track is streamed. What that means is, even if you have a really successful launch of your record and everybody is streaming it around the week of release, you're not going to make enough money. So with streaming, what we need is for people to keep coming back to the track for weeks and months and years, listening to the music again and again and again and again and again. Because if they keep coming back to the music and they keep playing it over a period of time, those micropayments we're getting from the streaming services are going to start to add up so that ultimately we make as much out of our streaming royalties as we would have made by selling a disc or a download on day one. In fact, we'll get to a point where actually we're making more money out of streaming than we would have made by selling our disc or download if people keep listening to the music again and again and again and again. So this poses marketing questions beyond all of the licensing challenges we've talked about here today. How do we get our new music onto the radar of potential listeners and fans at launch? But more than that, how do we persuade them to keep coming back to the music for weeks and months and years, listening to the music again and again and again, so that we make more money out of streaming than we would have done by selling them a disc or a download on day one? And that brings to an end this guide to the digital music market. The digital domain is constantly changing. New services come along, new licensing deals are struck. You need to stay on top of all of these changes and developments, and that's where we can help you. At CMU, we have a daily bulletin and a weekly podcast and a whole load of resources in the CMU library on our website. And if you go to completemusicupdate.com, you can check out all of that and stay up to date on all the latest changes in the world of digital music. And finally, if you would allow me one more plug, if you're super interested in how the streaming business works, or maybe you're interested in the controversy, because you may be aware that the business model I've described today, well, Some people think it's the wrong business model or it's an unfair business model. There have been lots of debates on that topic, and if you want to read more about all of those, well, I've written a book. Here it is. It's called Dissecting the Digital Dollar. If you Google that, you'll find that available online, and it goes through everything I've talked about today and a whole load more in quite a lot of detail. But hey, that'll wrap it up for this speed briefing. I hope you found it useful. Thank you so much for listening. I hope to see you again very soon. But in the meantime, goodbye, everybody.